I never thought assembling a bookshelf could feel like this. She was standing in the middle of the living room, hair tucked loosely behind one ear, a silk scarf draped casually over her shoulders, the sunlight catching the faint lines around her eyes in a way that made her look both effortless and real. Graceful, yes, but there was something else. A quiet vulnerability that lingered just under the surface, as if she was daring the world to notice it. I'll hold this side, I said, my voice slightly too loud, my hands hovering near the edge of the unfinished shelf. She didn't look at me when she said, "Careful, it's heavier than it looks." But her fingers brushed mine as she reached for the board, and that touch, light, almost accidental, made a strange little spark run through me. I noticed the small things, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, how her perfume, something soft, woody, with a hint of something I couldn't name, lingered even before she stepped closer. Even her breathing seemed deliberate, measured, but somehow magnetic, pulling me in without a single word. I lifted the shelf with her, feeling the warmth of her body just inches from mine. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel her exhale, a tiny tremor of air against my arm. And then her eyes met mine, dark, sharp, but not unkind. And I realized I'd been staring without thinking. She didn't pull away. She just held my gaze a second longer than necessary, tilting her head like she knew something I didn't. "Steady?" she said softly, almost like a whisper, and her voice made my chest tighten. I nodded, my hands gripping the wood a little too tightly, feeling the slight tremor of nerves I didn't want to admit. I could smell the faint hint of coffee from the cup on the counter, and for a second, the world outside the room didn't exist. There was only this careful choreography of hands, bodies, eyes, and unspoken words. She laughed suddenly, a short, unexpected sound that made me lose focus for a heartbeat. "You're staring again," she said, though it wasn't a scold, more like a tease. I tried to look anywhere but at her, but I couldn't. Every detail, the curve of her smile, the tilt of her neck, the soft rustle of her scarf, seemed designed to hold my attention hostage. And then she leaned closer, not enough to cross a line, but enough that her shoulder brushed mine, and I felt my pulse hitch. "You know," she murmured, "I don't usually let people help me with furniture." "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed me. "Why me?" Her eyes softened, just slightly, and for a second I thought I saw something vulnerable behind that confident gaze. But before she could answer, the sound of a door opening echoed through the quiet apartment. A sudden, jarring note that broke the tension like a dropped pin in a cathedral. We froze, our hands still lightly touching the shelf, eyes locked, hearts probably both thudding a little too fast. And for the first time I realized that whatever this was, this pull, this quiet electricity between us, it wasn't just about a bookshelf anymore. Something had shifted, and neither of us could ignore it. After the brief interruption, we settled back into our awkward rhythm, the silence heavy but not unpleasant. I couldn't stop noticing the subtle things about her, the faint crease of worry between her brows when she concentrated, the way her fingers grazed the edge of the shelf as if testing the wood. She moved around me with a natural ease, yet something in her posture hinted at caution, a quiet hesitance I wanted to unravel but dared not. She cleared her throat. I've been doing a lot on my own lately," she said, almost as if testing the waters. "You know, work, renovations, life in general." There was a vulnerability in her voice that contrasted sharply with her otherwise polished presence. I understood that. I'd grown up watching older people carry their burdens silently, careful not to burden anyone else. I nodded, pretending to be casual as my hands adjusted the shelf again. "Yeah, I get that." My voice sounded hollow to me, because I knew I could never fully explain why I was drawn to her. Not just her elegance or the way her laughter lingered in the air, but the quiet gravity she carried, as if she'd lived through more storms than I could imagine. She glanced at me, eyes narrowing slightly, curious or cautious. I couldn't tell. Then she leaned just a little closer, her shoulder brushing mine as she reached for a misplaced screwdriver. Her breath stirred against my ear, warm and faintly scented with the faint sweetness of her perfume. My heart thumped harder than I wanted to admit. I wanted to pull away and pretend nothing had happened, yet every instinct screamed to stay. There was risk here, and we both knew it. She was confident, self-possessed, years ahead of me in experience, in life. Me, 20, earnest, fumbling through emotions I barely understood. Outside the quiet apartment, the world would judge if it ever knew. And yet, the thought of stepping back felt unbearable. I needed to be closer, to bridge the gap that age and circumstance had erected between us. "You don't usually talk about yourself," she said, almost teasing, almost an accusation. I shifted, unsure whether to answer, feeling a flush creep up my neck. "Not much to tell," I muttered, though that wasn't true. I thought of the evenings spent alone, replaying conversations that never happened, wishing someone would notice me the way I noticed her. Her fingers lingered briefly on my shoulder as she adjusted the shelf's alignment, just long enough that a shiver ran through me. Neither of us said anything, but the air between us had changed, charged, taut, fragile. A shared glance, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were both aware of the risk, the pull, the quiet longing simmering beneath the surface. Finally, she stepped back, giving me space but not fully retreating. Her eyes held mine a second longer than necessary, and in that suspended moment, I realized we were no longer simply assembling furniture. We were testing boundaries, discovering a connection that neither of us could name aloud, but both of us felt. Her hand brushed mine again as she turned away, a subtle confirmation that we were tethered, however delicately, to each other. And for the first time since I'd walked in, I didn't want to leave. I was tightening the last screws when my phone buzzed, vibration harsh against the quiet apartment. A message from a friend flashed. "Still working there? Thought I'd drop by." I swallowed, heat rising, realizing how exposed the moment felt. She glanced at me, eyebrow raised, and for the briefest second our eyes locked, hers filled with something unreadable, maybe warning, maybe amusement. She moved closer to hand me a small Allen wrench, and our fingers brushed again. That tiny contact felt like static electricity, a shock too sweet to ignore. The apartment seemed impossibly small, the air thick. I noticed how her hair fell across her cheek, and how her lips parted slightly when she bent toward the shelf. I wanted to lean in, to close the gap, but my mind raced. Too soon. Too wrong. Someone could walk in. She straightened, and our shoulders pressed together. Just a heartbeat of pressure, but enough to send tremors down my spine. I dared a glance up, met her gaze, hers lingering, searching. My chest tightened. My pulse was deafening, the sound of my own restraint overwhelming me. "Did you need me to hold it steady?" I asked, voice uneven, betraying more desire than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, lips just barely brushing a quiet smile, as if weighing the tension between us. My hand twitched toward hers, almost touching again, and then we froze, the sound of keys in the lock. A visitor. My stomach plummeted. She moved a fraction closer, almost protective, and I realized my instinct was to shield her, even though I had no idea from what. The door opened, footsteps on the threshold, and I swallowed the rush of adrenaline and longing swirling in my chest. We were inches apart, our bodies aligned in a way that felt natural yet forbidden. I caught a subtle scent of her, a blend of warmth, coffee, and something uniquely hers, and it was dizzying. She laughed softly, not at me, not at the situation, just a low, intimate sound that seemed intended for me alone. My eyes followed the curve of her neck, the shift of her weight, the brush of her sleeve against mine. And then I wanted to lean in, to close the distance, to taste that moment, but I didn't. We remained in that suspended state, teetering on the edge of a line neither of us was ready to cross. Yet with each heartbeat, each accidental touch, each lingering glance, the pull between us grew undeniable. Finally, she exhaled softly, a whisper that seemed to echo inside my chest, a sound that held everything she wasn't saying. I felt her hand rest lightly on my arm, a tether, a promise, a confession without words. and I realized that even as we both tried to resist, we were closer than ever. Closer in a way that no one else could see, no one else could understand, and yet entirely impossible to ignore. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and our uneven breathing. I was crouched by the lower shelf, tightening a bracket, and she was standing above me, watching, her expression unreadable. I could feel her presence pressing into the small of my back, subtle but undeniable. Every nerve in my body was alert to her, the faint scent of vanilla and something warmer clinging to her hair, the way her scarf brushed against my shoulder when she leaned closer to inspect the shelf. "You're very precise," she said softly, almost a whisper, and I didn't look up. I didn't want to break the spell of proximity, the tension that coiled tight between us. "You make it easy to focus," I murmured, voice low, trying to anchor myself in the moment instead of my racing thoughts. But then she leaned down, closer than ever, her hand brushing hair from my forehead, fingers lingering, feather-light. The touch sent a jolt straight through me. My chest tightened. I realized I had been holding my breath. Her eyes met mine then, dark, searching, and for a split second I thought she might step back. But she didn't. Instead, she tilted her head, lips parted just slightly, as though she were daring me to cross a line neither of us had named. I shouldn't be feeling like this," she said, voice trembling just enough to betray her restraint. Her hand remained near my face, thumb brushing lightly over my temple. "It's complicated." I swallowed hard, my own restraint fraying. "I know," I said, the words barely audible, carried on a heartbeat between us. I wanted to tell her everything. How I'd noticed her from the first day, how I couldn't stop thinking about her, how every glance, every brush of her hand, had become a weight I couldn't shake. But I couldn't risk it. Yet, her chest pressed almost imperceptibly against my shoulder as she leaned forward to examine the bracket I was installing. My hand brushed hers. Not on purpose, or maybe entirely on purpose, and the electricity between us made it impossible to act like nothing had happened. We were inches apart. The warmth of her, the faint rhythm of her pulse through her neck and shoulders, was overwhelming. A sharp inhale escaped her lips, and I realized we were both teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Our eyes locked again, longer this time, and the room seemed to shrink until it was only us, suspended in tension and desire. She started, her voice dropping to almost nothing, and I could feel the words hanging between us. Unfinished, dangerous. My heart thudded, my hands frozen, my breath caught. Before the next word could land, the faint click of the front door echoed from the hallway. Someone coming, someone real, someone who could ruin the fragile balance we'd built. She froze. I froze. And in that suspended moment, inches from her lips, I realized how close we were, and how quickly everything could unravel. The air between us was taut, trembling, electric, and neither of us could look away. I was halfway through tightening the last screw when her phone buzzed, cutting through the quiet like a sudden electric shock. She glanced at the screen and froze, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her face. "It's nothing," she said quickly, sliding the phone into her pocket. But the tight set of her jaw betrayed her. I could feel it, the small tremor in her hand as she adjusted the shelf, the subtle shift of her weight as if she were bracing herself. "I can't tell if you're hiding something from me," I said carefully, heart hammering despite myself. Her eyes darted to mine, and for a fraction of a second, her usual calm cracked. I didn't want you to know yet," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. My chest tightened. She stepped closer, and the warmth radiating off her body made me conscious of every inch between us. I wanted to lean in, but a careful part of me hesitated. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, and in that motion, our arms brushed. A jolt shot through me, a combination of desire and sudden fear. My hand itched to cover hers, to linger, but I let it drop instead, almost in defiance of myself. "I overheard something today," she said, voice low, almost fragile. Someone I trusted, they mentioned you." Her eyes held mine, fierce but hesitant, and my stomach twisted with anticipation and dread. They think we shouldn't, whatever this is. The words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just the risk of the world noticing now. It was her admitting that even she was aware of the danger. My pulse spiked. Desire and fear collided in a way I couldn't disentangle. I don't care what anyone else thinks, I said, stepping closer, careful not to crowd her. But our proximity betrayed my words. Her shoulder brushed mine, just enough that the heat of her body pressed against mine, and I felt every heartbeat in sharp relief. She bit her lip, glancing away for a moment before letting her gaze drift back to me. And yet, she murmured, and I heard the hesitation in her tone. Her hand lingered near mine on the shelf, almost touching, almost daring me. The space between us felt impossible and yet magnetic, like we were drawn together by some force neither of us wanted to name. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the air denser. Every small movement, the tilt of her head, the brush of her sleeve against my arm, the tremor in her fingertips, carried weight I couldn't ignore. I wanted to reach out, to pull her close, but the truth she just admitted hung between us like an invisible barrier. And then she exhaled, soft, deliberate, and the faintest tremor ran through her body as she stepped slightly closer, eyes locked on mine. It was an invitation, a warning, and a challenge all at once. I swallowed hard, my hands twitching, the last screws forgotten. The risk was real, the danger palpable, and yet every fiber of me leaned forward, drawn to her. Something had shifted. Nothing would feel the same after this. And despite everything, I couldn't resist. The room was quiet, but it felt as though every sound was amplified. The soft hum of the heater, the faint creak of the floorboards, even our own breathing. We were close, closer than ever before, standing so near that the brush of her sleeve against my arm made me shiver. The shelf was forgotten, a backdrop to the tension that had been building between us for days. I shouldn't, she started, voice low, almost breaking. Her eyes searched mine, a flicker of hesitation, fear, and desire all wrapped together. I know, I whispered, stepping a fraction closer, careful not to crowd her yet wanting to erase every inch between us. Her perfume enveloped me, warm, soft, intimate, and I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. She exhaled slowly, letting her hands rest lightly on my shoulders. The gesture was casual, but her fingers lingered, and it sent an undeniable jolt through me. I wanted to lean in, to close the gap, but the world outside our little cocoon pressed in. Judgment, reason, fear, they all demanded we step back. And yet, neither of us moved. I can't stop thinking, I murmured, voice barely audible, carrying everything I hadn't dared to say before. Her eyes softened, and she leaned just slightly into me, her breath brushing my ear. A tremor ran through me, raw and human, the kind that made logic impossible. She pulled back just enough to look at me fully. I shouldn't, she repeated, but this time there was no scolding in her tone, only the quiet acknowledgement that she wanted this as much as I did. And in that instant, I understood everything about her. The confidence and the vulnerability, the control and the yearning, the fear and the courage that coexisted in a way that made her utterly human and entirely irresistible. The space between us seemed to contract. Our hands found each other's, tentative, trembling, seeking reassurance in the warmth of flesh and the press of palms. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she let me, leaning into the gesture as if it grounded her. Every second stretched, electric and heavy, the world outside forgotten. I don't care, I whispered. I don't care about what anyone thinks. Not anymore. Her lips parted slightly, a breath caught between us, and I could feel the answer in the way her fingers tightened over mine. We stood there, suspended on the edge of everything, hearts pounding, breaths mingling. And in that shared heartbeat, in that raw, messy closeness, we made our choice. No words were needed, no grand declarations. The room held us, trembling with unspoken want and quiet surrender. When we finally pulled back just enough to look at each other, our gazes met with clarity. full understanding of what we were, what we felt, and what this meant. The tension that had defined us for days didn't vanish. It transformed into something softer, deeper, honest. We knew each other fully now, and for the first time it felt like we could breathe. The room had quieted, the tension settling like dust after a storm. We weren't rushing anywhere. There was no need. The shelf stood upright, finally stable, but it no longer mattered. The work had been a pretext, a stage for the slow unraveling of our restraint. Now we simply existed in the same space, close enough to feel each other's warmth, far enough to let the moment breathe. She shifted slightly, brushing against me as she adjusted a book on the top shelf. I reached out almost instinctively, resting my hand lightly on her back. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, just enough for me to feel the steady weight of her body, and something in me unclenched. The nerves, the fear, the constant calculation, all melting under the simplicity of proximity. "I never thought I'd let someone help me like this," she murmured softly, voice intimate. Not teasing, not playful. My fingers found hers, and we intertwined without a word. The gesture said everything we hadn't dared to speak aloud. Trust, desire, understanding. Her forehead rested against mine for a long moment, eyes closed. I could feel her breathing, slow and steady, a fragile exhale that somehow grounded both of us. "Now," she whispered almost shyly, "let me lean on you." I laughed softly, the sound half disbelief, half relief, and pulled her closer. No hesitation, no restraint. Just two people finally allowing themselves to exist as they were, together. The age gap, the societal whispers, the private fears, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was here, in this room, in the gentle press of her body against mine, in the warmth of her hand in mine. We stayed like that, quietly, letting the moment stretch without forcing it. She tilted her head, lips brushing against my temple in the softest kiss, and I felt a calm settle over me. A sensation I hadn't realized I'd been craving, simple, human. Right? The shelf, the apartment, the world outside. It all faded into a blur. For the first time, I understood her fully, and I think she understood me. The past hesitations, the doubts, the unspoken what-ifs, they no longer held power. We had found a way past them, together. Eventually, we sat on the floor by the newly built shelf, shoulders touching, hands still entwined, a comfortable silence wrapping around us. No words were necessary. Every glance, every slight squeeze of her hand said more than any sentence could. And in that quiet, the story we had been living, tentative, raw, messy, and entirely ours, felt complete. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?